On my first day of work in the company cafeteria, wearing a hairnet and a starchy, ill-fitting uniform with the name Eleanor embroidered on the pocket, I walked out of the kitchen, past the steam trays and the salad bar, straight into the main boardroom, and took my seat at the head of the table. Hi, everyone. My name is Eleanor Vance, and many of you know me as Grandma Eleanor. I'm 76 years old, and I'm speaking to you today from my husband's old study, surrounded by his books, his blueprints, and the lingering comforting scent of the pipe tobacco he used to smoke. This is a story that until today, only one other person in the entire world knew the full truth of. It's the story of how my own son, the CEO of the company his father built, and my ambitious daughter-in-law came to believe that the best use for the founder's widow was to have her serve mashed potatoes to their employees. They have no idea who I really am. They have no idea what my husband, in his infinite wisdom, did to protect his legacy and to protect me. For the past 6 months, I have held this secret in my heart. A secret that has been both a terrible burden and a source of profound, quiet strength. But the time for secrets is over. The time for the truth has come. Before I begin, I hope you'll do me a small kindness that makes a world of difference. To do what I did, to walk into that boardroom and face my own son, took every ounce of courage I had. Your support, knowing you are out there listening, helps to replenish that courage. So please, take a moment to like this video and subscribe to our channel. It truly means the world to me. Thank you. To understand why a 76-year-old woman would agree to work in a cafeteria, you have to understand the man I was married to for 50 years. And to understand the twist that was to come, you have to understand the secret he left behind. Our story doesn't begin with a hairnet. It begins in a dusty garage, with a brilliant idea and a love that I thought was invincible. It all started, as the best things in my life did, with my Arthur. We met in college, two young dreamers. I was studying art history, and he was a brilliant, obsessive engineering student. He wasn't a man who was interested in making money. He was a man who was interested in making things that worked, things that lasted, things that made people's lives better. After we married, he spent every spare moment in our garage, tinkering, sketching, building. And then one day, he created it. The first Vance resonator, a small, elegant piece of audio technology that would revolutionize the way the world listened to music. It was his masterpiece. From that one invention, Vance Audio was born. We started the company with nothing but a second mortgage on our small house and a shared, terrifying, exhilarating dream. In those early years, I wasn't just the founder's wife. I was the entire administrative department. I was the one who answered the phones, who typed the invoices on a rickety old typewriter, who packed the first resonators into boxes on our dining room table. Arthur was the genius, the inventor, the soul of the company. But I was its heart. I knew every employee by name. I knew their wives, their children. Our annual company picnic, which I hosted in our own backyard, was the stuff of local legend. We weren't just building a company, we were building a family. And at the heart of that family was our son, David. From the time he was a little boy, David adored his father. He grew up in the shadow of the workshop, the smell of soldering wire and hot vacuum tubes the scent of his childhood. Arthur wasn't just his father, he was his hero. He taught David everything: how to read a schematic, how to test a circuit, how to treat every single employee, from the janitor to the head of sales, with the same level of respect and dignity. Our dream was that one day, David would take over the company, that he would carry on his father's legacy of innovation and integrity. For a long time, it seemed like that dream would come true. David was smart, he was capable, and he had his father's passion. He started in the mailroom and worked his way up, learning every single aspect of the business. I was so proud of him. The change, the slow, creeping, almost imperceptible shift began when he met Amanda, my daughter-in-law, Dottie. When David first brought her home, I was so relieved and happy for him. She was perfect. Or rather, she was perfectly polished. She was a high-powered corporate lawyer, beautiful, intelligent and ambitious, with a smile that was as bright and as hard as a diamond. She came from a different world, a world of mergers and acquisitions, of hostile takeovers and leveraged buyouts. Her language was the language of the bottom line. I welcomed her into our family with open arms. But from the very beginning, I felt a subtle, jarring dissonance. When she looked at Vance Audio, she didn't see a family. She didn't see a legacy. She saw an asset. An undervalued, slightly old-fashioned asset that could be streamlined, optimized, and prepared for a profitable exit. She would walk through the old, comfortable headquarters, the building Arthur had designed to feel more like a college campus than a factory, and I would see the look in her eyes. It was a look of cool, critical appraisal. Arthur's policy of lifetime employment for the senior staff is so wonderfully sentimental, she said to me once, her voice a silken trap. But it's not exactly a sustainable business model in the modern marketplace, is it? My Arthur believed that loyalty was a two-way street. Amanda believed that loyalty was a line item on a balance sheet that could be cut. My husband, in his quiet wisdom, saw it all. He saw the way Amanda's ambition was beginning to infect our son. He saw the subtle shifts in David's language, the way he started talking less about innovation and more about market share. He saw his son, the boy who had been raised by a creator, slowly being transformed into a corporate raider. And it broke his heart. 5 years ago, Arthur was diagnosed with a degenerative heart condition. He knew his time was short, and he knew he had to protect his life's work, the soul of his company, from the very son he had once dreamed would be its savior. He called me into his study one evening. Our family lawyer, a kind, old friend named Sam, was there. Arthur's face was pale, but his eyes were full of a fierce, clear-eyed resolve. "Eleanor, my love," he began, taking my hand. "I am going to make David the CEO of Vance Audio. It is his birthright, and I will not deny him that." My heart swelled with a sad, complicated pride. "But," he continued, his grip on my hand tightening, "I am not giving him the company. The company I am giving to you. Nange, Anity." He and Sam explained the plan. On paper, David would be the king. He would have the title, the corner office, the power to run the company day to day. But the actual ownership, the entirety of my and Arthur's controlling shares, over 60% of the company, would be placed into an irrevocable blind trust. A trust so secret, so deeply buried in a labyrinth of legal entities, that no one would ever know it existed. And I, Eleanor Vance, was to be the sole trustee, the silent, invisible, and ultimate power behind the throne. "Why, Arthur?" I whispered, my heart breaking for him, for the son he no longer trusted. "Because David is a good man, but he is weak," Arthur said, his voice full of a sorrowful paternal love. "And that woman he married is not. She will convince him to sell the company, to gut it, to fire the old-timers, to destroy everything we built, all for a quick, massive payday. I cannot let that happen. You, my Eleanor, you are the only one who has always understood the heart of this place. You are its guardian, its protector." And then he made me promise. "Promise me," he said, his eyes boring into mine, "that you will never reveal yourself unless you have to. Let him be the CEO. Let him have his pride. But if the day ever comes that he, or she, tries to destroy the soul of this company, promise me you will stop them." "None. And I came away." I promised. After Arthur passed, for 4 years, I kept my promise. I was the silent, grieving widow. David stepped into his father's shoes and became a seemingly capable, if somewhat more ruthless, CEO. And I, his loving mother, the woman he saw as a sweet, slightly dotty old lady who knew nothing of business. I would sit quietly in the corner at the annual shareholders' meetings, the anonymous, silent, and all-powerful majority shareholder, and I would watch. I watched as Amanda's influence grew. I watched as the company's culture began to change, as the old family feeling was replaced by a cold, corporate efficiency. I watched, and I waited. I hoped, with all my heart, that the day would never come when I would have to fulfill the second part of my promise to my husband. But then, about a year ago, it came. and it came not for the company, but for me. The attack on my life did not begin with a corporate maneuver. It began, as these things so often do, with a quiet, insidious campaign of loving, well-intentioned, and utterly soul-crushing concern. It was a slow, methodical siege on my independence, my purpose, and my very identity, all orchestrated by my daughter-in-law, Amanda, with my own son, David, as her willing and tragically blind first lieutenant. After Arthur died, I was, of course, devastated, but I was not helpless. I had my home, my garden, my friends, my volunteer work at the local museum. My life was quiet, but it was full. I was grieving, but I was not broken. But that was not the story Amanda wanted to tell. In her world, a world of constant, forward-moving ambition, a 75-year-old widow, living alone in a big house, was a problem. A loose end. A resource that was not being properly utilized. And Amanda was a woman who believed, with an almost religious fervor, in the utilization of all resources. It started with the visits. They would come for Sunday dinner, and the conversation would inevitably gently be steered towards my situation. "Eleanor, we're just worried about you," Amanda would begin, her voice a perfect symphony of soft, gentle, and deeply manipulative concern. She would reach across the table and place her cool, manicured hand on my own. All alone in this big house, it must be so quiet, so empty. My house was not empty. It was filled with the warm, comforting ghosts of my 50-year marriage. But she was not talking about ghosts. She was talking about productivity. David would then chime in, his voice full of the earnest, loving concern he had learned from his wife. "Mom, she's right. You've spent your whole life taking care of Dad, of me, of the company. You deserve to, well, you deserve to have a purpose." A purpose. The word was a subtle, poisoned dart. As if my life, my quiet, full, and deeply meaningful life, had no purpose of its own. As if a woman's only purpose was to be in service to others. My inner monologue was a low, simmering protest. My garden is my purpose. My friends are my purpose. My memories are my purpose. But I would just smile, a small, polite, and deeply weary smile, and say, "Oh, don't you two worry about me. I'm keeping myself perfectly busy." But they were relentless. They saw my contentment not as a sign of a life well lived, but as a symptom of a lack of ambition, a gentle senility. They began a campaign to find me a new purpose, one that they could understand, one that fit into their world of schedules and goals and measurable outcomes. First, it was hobbies. Amanda signed me up for a pottery class without asking me. "It will be so good for you, Eleanor, to get your hands dirty, to be creative," she had chirped, handing me the gift certificate. I was already a painter, a fact she had either forgotten or chosen to ignore. Then, it was social clubs. Chloe enrolled me in a high-end, exclusive book club, filled with the wives of CEOs and investment bankers. "You need to be around stimulating people, Mom," David had said. "People who are engaged with the world." The implication, of course, was that my own friends, the wives of teachers and carpenters and librarians, were not. I went to these things to please them. I sat in the pottery class, my hands feeling clumsy and alien in the cold, wet clay. I sat in the book club, a silent, invisible ghost, listening to women in designer clothes discuss the latest bestseller with a kind of competitive, intellectual ferocity that had nothing to do with the love of a good story. I was performing a role for them, the role of the engaged, active, and properly managed senior. But it was a role that felt hollow and false and deeply, deeply exhausting. The sentence rhythm of my life, which had been a long, comfortable, and self-directed narrative, became a series of short, scheduled, and deeply unwelcome appointments. Monday, pottery-dottery. Wednesday, book club. Friday, a healthy lunch with Amanda. On cutting shell. The most cutting dialogues were the ones that were filled with praise for my efforts to conform. "We're so proud of you, Mom," David would say, his voice full of a patronizing approval. You're really making an effort. You're not just giving up. Giving up. They had seen my quiet, contented life of grief and memory as a form of surrender. And they were now praising me for my willingness to be rehabilitated, to be molded into a more acceptable, more productive, and less embarrassing version of my old self. The recurring hurtful details were a constant reminder of their judgment. Amanda would bring me gifts, self-help books with titles like Ageless Ambition and Retire Rich and Active. She was not giving me gifts. She was giving me homework. She was giving me a curriculum for a life she had deemed inadequate. I lived in a state of quiet, polite, and deeply resentful submission. I was so busy trying to be the person they wanted me to be. I was losing sight of the woman I actually was. And the shame of it was a constant, low-grade fever. Shame that I was not living up to their expectations. Shame that I was not strong enough to tell them to simply leave me alone. The final phase of their campaign, the one that would lead to the hairnet and the cafeteria, began about 6 months ago. It was a masterpiece of corporate, manipulative, and deeply insulting logic. They sat me down once again in my husband's study. They had the same serious, loving, and utterly false expressions on their faces. "Eleanor," Amanda began, her voice a low, confidential murmur. "David and I have been talking, and we've come up with an idea, a brilliant idea." David leaned forward, his face full of an earnest, boyish excitement that I knew, from long experience, was a prelude to a truly terrible suggestion. "Mom," he said, "you were the heart of this company for 50 years. You knew everyone. You understood the culture, the employees. They loved you." "That's true," I said, a flicker of my old pride stirring in my heart. "And the company, it's not the same without you," he continued. "The morale, the family feeling, it's been missing since since you left." "Ye didn't leave," I thought. "You and your wife pushed me out." "Well, so," Amanda said, moving in for the kill, "we want you to come back." My heart, for a single foolish moment, gave a hopeful leap. They wanted me back. They valued me. They had finally realized that their cold, corporate, bottom-line-driven world was missing a soul. "We've created a new position," David said, his voice swelling with a sense of his own benevolent genius. "A position that is perfect for you. A position where you can really contribute." Contribute. The word from their lips was not a compliment. It was an accusation. It was the verdict in a long, silent trial. I had been found guilty of the crime of not contributing. Amanda slid a single, beautifully printed piece of paper across my husband's desk. It was a job description. "We're calling it the Director of Employee Morale and Wellness," she said, her voice full of a smug satisfaction. "You would be a presence in the company, a friendly, familiar face. You would work in the company cafeteria during the lunch rush. You'd get to interact with all the employees, to be that warm, grandmotherly presence that everyone has been missing. It would give you a purpose, a schedule, a way to be a part of the Vance audio family again, a way to contribute." I stared at the piece of paper. I stared at the job title, Director of Employee Morale and Wellness. And then I stared at the job description. Duties include serving on the main cafeteria line during peak hours, maintaining a clean and welcoming dining environment, providing a warm and supportive presence to all employees. They were not offering me a job. They were offering me a hairnet. They were offering me a place on the other side of the steam trays. They had looked at the founder's widow, the co-creator of the entire company, the silent, secret, and all-powerful majority shareholder, and they had decided that the best, most dignified, and most useful role for her was to serve mashed potatoes and gravy to the junior accountants. The sheer breathtaking and utterly magnificent scale of their miscalculation. It was a thing of almost sublime beauty. They were not just insulting me. They were not just devaluing me. They were, in their infinite, arrogant, and MBA-educated blindness, handing me the keys to the entire kingdom. They were not just offering me a job in the cafeteria. They were, unwittingly, inviting the queen back into the castle, disguised as a scullery maid. And I, for the first time in a very long time, I felt the ghost of my Arthur, my brilliant, laughing, and deeply wise Arthur, standing beside me. And I could almost hear him whisper in my ear, "Go on, my love. Take the job." The look on my face, as I stared at that beautifully printed job description, was a masterpiece of performance art. I let my eyes widen slightly. I let my mouth fall open in a look of stunned, almost tearful gratitude. I looked from the paper to my son's hopeful, expectant face, to my daughter-in-law's smug, triumphant one. "Oh, David, Amanda," I whispered, my voice a perfect imitation of a lonely old woman who has just been thrown a lifeline. I don't know what to say. This is the kindest, most thoughtful thing anyone has ever done for me. Mine? The look of profound, self-congratulatory relief that washed over their faces was a sight to behold. They had done it. They had solved the problem of Mother Dartwhiter. They had taken their useless, grieving, and increasingly eccentric old relative, and then they had given her a purpose. They had, in their minds, just performed a great act of corporate and familial charity. "We knew you'd love it, Mom," David said, beaming. He was so proud of himself, so proud of his own benevolent genius. "Of course, Eleanor," Amanda added, her voice a silken purr of satisfaction. "You are the heart of this company. We just wanted to give you a way to be a part of it again, in a way that is manageable for you." "Went your name? And manageable." The word was a tiny, perfect jewel of condescension. And so, I accepted the job. My own son, the CEO of Vance Audio, the company his father and I had built from nothing, formally hired his 76-year-old mother to be a cafeteria lady. The week leading up to my first day was a masterclass in humiliation, a series of small, excruciating tortures that I endured with a quiet and increasingly steely resolve. First, there was the onboarding, a process that was orchestrated by Amanda with a chilling corporate efficiency. She sent me a package of new employee paperwork to fill out. Tax forms, a direct deposit authorization for my minimum wage salary, and a non-disclosure agreement, a document that she had, I am sure, drafted herself, full of dense legal jargon about protecting corporate secrets. The irony of me, the majority shareholder, signing a document promising not to reveal the secrets of my own company, was so profound, it was almost comical. Then came the fitting for the uniform. Amanda took me herself to a stark industrial uniform supply warehouse. A bored, gum-chewing woman measured me, her hands rough and impersonal. And they presented me with the uniform. A stiff, starchy polyester pantsuit in a particularly unflattering shade of beige, and a hairnet, a flimsy, elasticized, and deeply, deeply undignified hairnet. "It's for hygiene, Mom," David had explained to me later on the phone, his voice full of a strained, embarrassed patience when I had mentioned it. "Everyone in food service has to wear one. It's the law." I knew it was the law. But, for me, that hairnet was not a piece of protective gear. It was a crown of thorns. It was a symbol of my new, lowly, and utterly invisible status. But the most cutting dialogue, the most revealing and painful part of the entire process, was the training. The day before I was due to start, Amanda insisted on giving me a tour of the cafeteria and introducing me to my new manager. We walked into the vast, gleaming, and incredibly noisy company cafeteria during the lunch rush. It was a place I had walked through 1,000 times as the founder's wife, as Mrs. Vance, a woman who would be greeted with smiles and respectful nods. Today, I was invisible. I was just a well-dressed old woman trailing in the wake of the CEO's powerful, elegant wife. Amanda led me back through the swinging doors into the chaotic, steamy, and deafeningly loud world of the kitchen. And she introduced me to my new boss, a woman named Marge, the head of food service. Marge was a large, formidable woman with a face that looked like it had been carved from a block of granite and a voice that could strip paint off a wall. She had been with the company for 30 years. I had hired her myself. I remembered her as a shy, hard-working young woman. Now, she was the undisputed queen of this kitchen. And she had, clearly, been given her marching orders. "Marge," Amanda said, her voice a bright, commanding shout over the clatter of pots and pans. "This is Eleanor, David's mother. She's our new director of employee morale. She'll be starting tomorrow. I want you to show her the ropes." Marge looked me up and down, her expression a mixture of pity, confusion, and a deep, weary resignation. She knew who I was. She knew this was a farce. But she was an employee, and her boss's wife had just given her a direct order. "Right," she grunted. The ropes. For the next hour, I was subjected to the most surreal and humiliating training session of my life. Marge, with a kind of brutal efficiency, showed me my new duties. She showed me how to operate the industrial-grade dishwasher. She showed me how to properly stack the trays. And she showed me my primary station, the hot food line, the steam trays filled with mashed potatoes and green beans, and a mystery meatloaf that looked gray and sad under the heat lamps. "Your main job," Marge said, her voice flat, "is to scoop. 1 scoop of potatoes, 1 ladle of gravy. Don't give them more, or you'll mess up the portion control numbers. Got it?" I nodded, my voice a small, strangled whisper. Got it. The recurring hurtful detail of that hour was the invisibility. The other kitchen staff, people I had known for decades, people whose children's graduation parties I had attended, they would not look me in the eye. They would scurry past me, their faces averted, their bodies radiating a mixture of embarrassment and fear. They knew this was wrong. They knew this was a degradation, but they were powerless to stop it. And I, in my new beige, polyester uniform, I was no longer one of them. I was a problem, a ghost, a source of profound and deeply dangerous workplace awkwardness. My inner monologue, during that long, terrible hour, was a quiet, steady, and increasingly cold mantra. Remember this. Remember the smell of the grease. Remember the clatter of the trays. Remember the averted eyes. Remember the pity. Remember the shame. Remember the hairnet. Remember the scoop. This was not just a humiliation. This was intelligence. This was reconnaissance. I was a spy in my own kingdom, and I was gathering the ammunition I would need for the final battle. As we were about to leave, Amanda delivered the final, perfect, and utterly revealing blow. She turned to me, her face a mask of bright, helpful, and deeply insulting concern. "Now, Eleanor," she said, her voice loud enough for Marge and the other nearby kitchen staff to hear. "I know this is all new to you, and we are so grateful that you're willing to contribute. But it's very important that we maintain a professional environment. So when you're here, you're not Mrs. Vance, the founder's widow. You're just Eleanor, a member of the food service team. And David is not your son. He's very important that you remember to respect the boundary, do you?" She was not just giving me a job. She was stripping me of my name. She was erasing my history. She was demanding that I, in a final act of submission, collude in my own annihilation. I looked at her beautiful, smiling, and utterly monstrous face, and I smiled back. A small, meek, and perfectly subservient smile. "Yes, Amanda," I said, my voice a quiet, respectful whisper. "I understand perfectly." She beamed, pleased with my easy compliance. She thought she had won. She thought she had finally and completely put the old woman in her place. She had no idea what place I was about to take. My first, and as it turned out, my last day of work as the Director of Employee Morale and Wellness began at 6 o'clock in the morning. I stood in front of my own full-length mirror in my own beautiful, spacious bedroom, and I looked at my reflection, and I did not recognize the woman who was looking back at me. The beige polyester uniform was as stiff and as soulless as I had remembered. It smelled faintly of industrial starch. But the final and most devastating piece of the costume was the name tag. It was a simple, plastic, pin-on name tag. On it, in a stark, blocky, impersonal font was a single word: Eleanor Torrent. Not Mrs. Vance. Not Catherine. Just Eleanor. A first name. The name of a servant. I pinned it onto the pocket of my uniform. And in that small, simple, and deeply humiliating act, the final vestiges of the woman I had been, the founder's wife, the matriarch, the heart of this company, were finally and completely erased. The drive to the company headquarters, the beautiful sprawling campus that Arthur and I had built, was the most surreal and agonizing drive of my life. I parked my old, comfortable sedan, not in my reserved spot by the front entrance, the one that had been marked E. Vance for 50 years, but in the sprawling, anonymous employee parking lot at the far end of the campus. I walked through the back entrance, the service entrance, a door I had never used before in my life. The air was already thick with the smell of brewing coffee and frying bacon. I walked into the kitchen, and the morning crew, the real hard-working heart of this place, they all stopped what they were doing. They just stared at me, their faces a mixture of shock, horror, and a deep, profound, and deeply uncomfortable pity. Marge, my new manager, just grunted at me. "You're late," she said, even though I was 15 minutes early. "Get a hairnet on. The breakfast rush starts in 10. The final straw, the thing that finally and completely severed the last, thinnest thread of my old identity, was the hairnet. It was a flimsy, elasticized web of pure, unadulterated humiliation. I went into the small, windowless employee locker room, and I stood in front of a cracked, grimy mirror. And I put it on. I tucked my proud silver hair, the hair my Arthur had loved to run his fingers through, into a cheap disposable net, like a fish caught and ready for market. For the next 4 hours, I lived in a nightmare. I was a ghost, a non-person. I stood behind the steam trays, a silent, anonymous figure in a beige uniform, and I scooped. I scooped scrambled eggs that were pale and watery. I scooped greasy, limp bacon. I scooped lumpy, gray oatmeal. The employees of the company my husband and I had founded, they would file past me. Some of them, the older ones, the ones who had been with us for years, they would look at me, their eyes wide with a look of such profound, horrified disbelief, that it was like a physical blow. They would open their mouths to say something, to ask, "Mrs. Vance, what are you doing here?" But then they would see the look on my face, the blank, empty, and utterly defeated look I had so carefully practiced. And they would close their mouths, and they would quickly look away, their faces a mask of shame and fear. They were afraid for their own jobs. They knew in that instant that this was a place where loyalty was no longer a virtue, but a liability. The younger ones, the new generation of employees that David and Amanda had hired, they didn't even see me. I was just a part of the machinery. An old, slow, and slightly invisible food service worker. They would bark their orders at me. Extra bacon, just the egg whites. They would slide their trays along the metal rail, their eyes fixed on their phones, without a single glance, without a single word of thanks. I was not a person. I was a function, a scooper, a pair of hands in a set of disposable plastic gloves. And in those 4 long and deeply agonizing hours, I finally and completely understood the true nature of my son's and my daughter-in-law's crime. They had not just tried to humiliate me. They had not just tried to devalue me. They had tried to make me invisible, to erase me, to turn me from the founder, the matriarch, the heart of this company, into a faceless, nameless, and utterly disposable unit of labor. At precisely 10:30 a.m., Marge came over to my station. "All right, Eleanor," she grunted. "Your break. 15 minutes. Don't be late." I nodded. I took off my plastic gloves, and I walked out of the kitchen. I did not go to the employee break room. I did not go to the restroom. I began to walk. I walked out of the cafeteria, my sensible rubber-soled shoes making a soft, squeaking sound on the polished linoleum floor. I walked through the main atrium, past the bustling employees, past the security desk. A few people looked up, their faces a picture of confused surprise, to see one of the cafeteria ladies walking with a strange, calm, and deeply purposeful stride towards the executive wing. I did not stop. I walked down the long carpeted hallway, the hallway that was lined with portraits of the company's history. A picture of a young, smiling Arthur breaking ground on this very building. A picture of me cutting the ribbon at the grand opening. I walked past my own history, a ghost in a hairnet. I arrived at the end of the hall. Before me were two large, imposing mahogany doors. The doors to the main boardroom. I knew, from the discreet, electronic schedule on the wall, that the quarterly board meeting was scheduled to begin at 11 o'clock. I knew that my son David and all of his hand-picked, Amanda-approved vice presidents were already in there, drinking coffee, preparing for their meeting. And I, in my beige, polyester uniform, with my plastic name tag that read Eleanor, and my crown of humiliating, elasticized mesh, I reached out, and I pushed the doors open. The moment I pushed open those heavy mahogany doors, a sudden profound silence fell over the room. 12 pairs of eyes, the eyes of the most powerful and important people in my husband's company, all swiveled in my direction. They were sitting around the enormous, polished, boat-shaped table that my Arthur had designed himself. At the head of the table, in the large, throne-like leather chair that had been his father's, sat my son, David. The look on his face was a masterpiece. It was a symphony of shock, of confusion, of a dawning, horrified, and deeply public embarrassment. The cafeteria lady, his crazy, senile old mother, had just wandered into the most important meeting of the quarter. "Mom," he said, his voice a low, strangled whisper, thick with a furious, panicked disbelief. "What are you doing here? You're not supposed to be in here." His vice presidents, his sleek, ambitious, and deeply sycophantic executive team were all staring, their mouths slightly agape. They were looking from their CEO's horrified face to the strange, calm, and utterly out-of-place old woman in the doorway. I did not say a word. I just stood there for a moment, letting them all take in the full, glorious, and deeply surreal spectacle of it. Me, in my hairnet. Me, in my name tag. And then I began to walk. I walked, with a slow, deliberate, and utterly unshakable calm, across the deep, plush corporate carpet. I walked past the row of stunned vice presidents. I walked directly to the head of the table, to the empty chair that sat to the right of my son, the chair that had always for 50 years been mine. I reached up, and with a slow, deliberate motion, I unpinned the plastic name tag from my uniform. I placed it, very gently, on the polished table in front of my son. Then I reached up and I took off the hairnet. I shook my head, letting my silver hair fall freely onto my shoulders. And then I sat down, in my chair. I looked at my son. His face was a mask of pure, apoplectic rage. "Mother," he hissed, his voice a low, vicious snarl, so that only I could hear. Get out, right now." I did not look at him. I looked down the long, polished table, at the 12 stunned faces that were all staring at me. And I found my voice. It was not the voice of the meek, gentle, grieving widow. It was not the voice of the silent, invisible cafeteria worker. It was the voice of Eleanor Vance, the co-founder of this company, the woman who had packed the first resonators on her dining room table. It was the voice of the Queen, who had just, very quietly and very publicly, returned to her throne. "Good morning, gentlemen," I said, and my voice was calm, clear, and rang with an authority that none of them had ever heard from me before. "I do apologize for the interruption, and for my attire. I have been, as I am sure you are all now aware, working undercover. I have been conducting a deep and thorough, on-the-ground analysis of employee morale." I let that hang in the air for a moment. I could see the confusion, the dawning, terrified comprehension in their eyes. "My husband, Arthur," I continued, my voice now taking on a tone of quiet, steely, and deeply nostalgic power, "believed that this company was a family. He believed that our greatest asset was not our patents or our market share, but our people. And I am afraid that in the years since his passing, that core principle has been eroded. I looked directly at my son. The color was draining from his face. Therefore, I said, and my voice was now the voice of a CEO, a chairwoman, a woman who was about to execute the most satisfying hostile takeover in the history of corporate America. I have decided, as the majority shareholder of this company, to make some changes. The word majority shareholder landed in the silent, stunned boardroom with the force of a bomb. I reached into the large, unflattering pocket of my beige polyester uniform, and I pulled out a single folded piece of paper. It was a copy of the final page of my husband's will, the page that detailed the existence of the secret, irrevocable blind trust, and I slid it across the polished table to my son. He looked at it. His hands trembled as he unfolded it. He read the words that detailed his father's final, brilliant, and deeply mistrustful act of love and protection. He saw my name. He saw the words, egg sole, trustee. He saw the 60% controlling interest. And I watched as my son, my brilliant, ambitious, and utterly defeated son, the man who had tried to erase me, finally and completely, understood. He had not just underestimated his mother. He had underestimated his father. He looked up at me, his eyes wide with a look of such profound, abject, and soul-crushing horror. He had been the king, and he had just realized that he had, all along, been nothing more than a regent, a placeholder, a puppet. And his mother, the sweet, dotty old cafeteria lady, had been the one pulling the strings all along. The silence in that boardroom was the most profound, most absolute silence I have ever heard. It was thicker than velvet, heavier than lead. The only sound was the frantic, panicked rasp of my son's breathing. He stared at the document, then at me, his face a mask of utter, uncomprehending horror. The world he had so carefully, so ruthlessly constructed had just been demolished by a single piece of paper, presented by a woman in a beige cafeteria uniform. The 12 vice presidents, the men who had been his loyal, sycophantic followers, were now staring at me. Their expressions had shifted from confusion to a dawning, terrified respect. They were sharks, all of them, and they had just seen a bigger, quieter, and much, much older shark enter the water. As I was saying, I continued, my voice calm and even, as if I had not just detonated a nuclear bomb in the center of the room, I will be making some changes, effective immediately. I will be assuming my rightful position as the chairwoman of the board of Vance Audio. I looked down the table, and my first act as chairwoman will be to address the clear and catastrophic crisis in employee morale. The culture of fear and disposability that has been allowed to fester in this company, my husband's company, is over today. I then went on, in a calm, clear, and deeply detailed voice, to outline my new vision for the company. A return to Arthur's core principles. A renewed focus on innovation over profit-mongering. A reinstatement of the lifetime employment policy for senior staff. And the creation of a new, and very real, employee wellness program. One that would be funded by a significant reduction in executive bonuses, starting with the CEOs. With every word I spoke, I could feel the power in the room shifting, flowing away from my son and towards me. He just sat there, frozen, a king who had been publicly and humiliatingly checkmated. When I was finished, I turned to him. My voice was no longer the voice of the chairwoman. It was the quiet, cold, and deeply disappointed voice of a mother. "David," I said, so that only he could hear, "you are a brilliant businessman, but you are a terrible son, and you are a disgrace to your father's memory. You have two options. You can resign, quietly today for personal reasons, or you can be fired publicly tomorrow for cause. The choice is yours." And he didn't have to choose. He just slumped in his chair, a broken, defeated man, and he nodded. The consequences were swift and absolute. David resigned that afternoon. The company announcement cited his desire to spend more time with his family, a corporate euphemism that everyone in the business world understood. Amanda, his brilliant, ambitious wife, the woman who had orchestrated my humiliation, did not take the news well. Her husband was no longer the powerful, wealthy CEO she had married. He was just a disgraced, unemployed man. Their marriage, a partnership built on ambition and greed, did not survive the implosion of their shared future. They were divorced within the year. And me? I became the most unlikely, and I must admit, the most beloved CEO in the history of our industry. I sold our big, empty house, the one that was full of so many sad memories. I moved into a beautiful, comfortable apartment in the city, and I went to work. I spent the next 2 years, the last 2 years of my working life, putting my husband's company back together. I brought back the old-timers, the ones David and Amanda had so callously discarded. I reinstated the company picnic. I walked the factory floor every single day, and I learned every new employee's name, just as I had in the beginning. I brought the heart, the soul, the family back to Vance Audio. The greatest lesson I learned is that true power is not loud. It is not arrogant. It is not found in a fancy title or a corner office. True power is quiet. It is patient. It is the power of knowing who you are and what you are worth, even when the world and the people you love most try to tell you that you are worthless. So now, I speak to you, to anyone out there who has ever been made to feel small or invisible or past their prime, to anyone who has ever been devalued, dismissed, or told to contribute in a way that demeans your soul. Do not ever let anyone else write your job description for you. You are the CEO of your own life, and you have the right at any moment to walk into that boardroom, to take your rightful seat at the head of the table, and to remind them and yourself of exactly who is in charge. Thank you for being here today, for letting me share this final and most satisfying chapter of my long life. If this story has given you a little spark of your own quiet power, I would be so grateful if you would like this video, subscribe, and hit that notification bell. In the comments below, I would love for you to share a story about a time when you surprised everyone, most of all yourself, with your own strength. Love you all. This is Grandma Eleanor, and I'll see you in the next story.